Tanse, Erica Violet Lee, Nehiyaw, Masasko Tomanek, Egla PSO Oasis Nizotsen. My name is Erica Violet Lee, and I'm coming to you today from inner city Saskatoon, Treaty 6 homelands in Saskatchewan on the beautiful prairies in the land currently referred to as Canada by some people. I was invited here today to read some of my poetry, some of my work, and I also read some of my work yesterday just for a short little while to start Scholar Strike. And I think that the poems that I read yesterday were poems that focused on, well, I should say that all of my poems focus on themes of righteous anger and love in a political sense, in that when we resist as Indigenous people, for Black people, for marginalized and oppressed peoples, when we resist with anger and rage, it comes from a place of love. And even if it doesn't, I don't want to paint everyone with the same brush, because sometimes love is the last thing you feel. But what I like to say that I do is write love poems, because it seems like such a simple act. And it's often very feminized too, the idea of writing love poems. But when I write a love poem, it's always toward abolition. It's always toward the end of policing and the end of prisons. This is because the people that I love in my life, my mom, my friends, my community, the loved ones that are my kin that I may not know at this point or may never meet, are facing horrible oppressions in the form of police violence, prison brutalities. And I guess I want to be able to push boundaries and say, we can imagine more. I've taken a lot from the work of Black feminist poets, Black queer poets, and theorists who taught me that love poetry can be political. So I'll start today with a poem called Zinzibakwad. I used to know a girl who could read the sky and lower her body temperature to hide from the heat-seeking radars of police helicopters. We sat around most nights, sharing beers and tips for getting over heartbreak and the best recipes for shiny hair. In a few hours, we had used all our Anishinaabe Moin and Nehiyaw and Lakota, Denesutline, strung together phrases echoing into the night until we fall asleep exhausted, but feeling something like free. Now, she comforted, at least you will know love when it comes. You will know what it has to feel like, what it must be. Lap it up like syrup dripping from the split in the tree bark, licking and kissing the cuts as if our saliva was a healing potion, as if our mouths had anything so sweet to give back to trees. I was in a Zoom call the other day, and someone brought up Tommy Pico, who is a Native American poet who wrote a book called Nature Poem. It's, I guess, a long form poem about how Indigenous folks, Native folks, aren't allowed to write about nature without it being turned into some sort of essentialist biological urge, rather than our own agential decision to write about the earth and our relationship to it. So that I think of as a form of love too. This next one is called A Home for Tired Warrior Women. Our elder came to the door with the gifts. She massaged the bear grease into my mama's sore back, and after, my mama said she had never felt stronger. I think it was the touch as much as it was the grease. That very act of allowing another woman's warm hands to melt medicine into her naked skin. I never got along with notions of two-spirit sacredness that rely on biological essentialism. Our bodies are not simply portals, nor vessels, nor symbols, but whole alone and wholly together. Alphabet City. This one is dedicated to the inner city in Saskatoon, where I grew up, where I live, where I have gathered so much of my teachings, my wisdom, my know-how when it comes to survival, and definitely a lot of my beliefs about love. I wrote this particular poem, Alphabet City, in a period of time when there were multiple shooting deaths in our community. And it feels sometimes like poetry is an insufficient response to that level of violence, to the level of violence that we face daily as Indigenous people, for Black people, for other oppressed and marginalized groups. Particularly, I think about class more often now, as Indigenous folks have gained recognition in the colonial sphere of Canada, as and Howard Adams wrote about this in the 1970s in his book Prison of Grass, the danger of an Indigenous middle class that becomes counter-revolutionary because their interests are more tied up in capitalism than their own people. So I believe it's impossible for us to discuss race, colonialism, indigeneity, whatever that means, whatever it might mean, without discussing class, without discussing poverty and what it means to be poor. In my weaker moments, I have wished that everything true and worthy of time did begin and end with love. It would be easier, give us a moment's rest, if I knew my endless search for answers led somewhere other than your hands, the weight of your chest on mine. I would be lighter, I would be less afraid. It would be easier if everything didn't begin and end with love. In my weaker moments, I have prayed to replace your memory with a thunderbird, shut my curtains to refuse daylight, and ask the dark to make time less linear, less precious, so you could pull up a chair and stay a while. Let us keep shrines for everyone killed here until the ground becomes a carpet of pink flowers. Polite. How old is this country? 1867, 1885, 1982, 1996. The answer is not as old as Nookham's stories. Tear away the veneer of the small, gentle languages we have been taught to use to politely name fascism and name their hatred. Say genocide, say abolition, say abolition, say abolition. Name this place's fragility. Say this empire is breakable. Say this empire will be broken. Say this empire must be broken. Put away our civilized tongues and sing it in their faces. It must be broken open. The next poem I'm going to read is one of my newer ones. These are all, most of them are going to be in a collection of poetry, my first collection of poetry released with McClelland and Stewart, which will be released in, I just found out, March 2023, so a year from now. But it gets taken out of my hands quite soon. So I'm deciding at this point what poems I want in it, what poems are good enough to dedicate to my community. And this one in particular was written about an experience I had with police officers on our street. This was a couple summers ago, and there's always cops on our block. I live in a predominantly Indigenous, poor neighborhood, and there are always cops trolling around the neighborhood at every hour of the day. There are cops sitting in their cars outside my house a lot of the time, always being surveilled, always being monitored by the police. And everyone in this neighborhood knows they're not our friends. Everyone in this neighborhood knows not to call them if something happens, because if we do, there's a good chance someone will end up dead or severely hurt. So this one has a Cree title, and it's a working title, so I won't give you the title yet, but it goes like this. 8 cops on our block and me, standing in the street in my pajamas, asking why. The answerer sneers, because we travel in packs like wolves. This man looks to his commanding officer for a subtle grin, an affirmation that his statement was correct, and being met with silence gives the same effect. That night, I fall asleep to the low baseline hum of the police plane above the inner city. I dream about wolf teeth, and in the morning, I wake to sirens. I was taught that the best way to become unafraid is to face the fear head on. So I buy a book about wolves and learn that mostly they want nothing to do with the violence of humans. Sometimes in our stories, wolves even save the whole world. And everyone in this hood knows cops do nothing but destroy it. I sit with fury in my chest for each relative stolen by those who claim no distinction between the use of terror in cruel service of occupation and struggle in hope of a better existence. I want the young ones in our communities to grow up knowing that an abbreviated life is not inevitable. And although we are captured and culled, they remain the real trespassers on still woven land. That night, I fall asleep to the low baseline hum of the police plane above the inner city. I dream about running free, and in the morning, I wake. The next poem I have is one that I released recently on Valentine's Day. I'm trying to think. I guess I wrote it after I heard this old blues song. It's a blues standard called Bring Me Flowers While I'm Living by Petey Wheatstraw. So I believe is a St. Louis blues musician. And I think the song is from the 30s or 40s. I love old blues so much. And the song lyrics go, bring me flowers while I'm living, then don't bring them while I'm dead. Something about those lyrics and that song reminded me of the usage of red dresses on hangers or red items of clothing, typically a dress, that are placed on hangers and hung out on trees or clotheslines or just like in windows to represent missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit people, trans folks, queer folks. But typically, it's obviously like a very cis woman-centric form of commemoration, though lots of people have tried to queer it, which I definitely acknowledge as something important to do. And so this poem, I thought about those red dresses and the feeling it gives me when I see a red dress hanging on a hanger without a body in it. Red is my favorite color, and I recently ordered this gorgeous red dress that I'm so excited to wear. And like, this is the dress that I want to. I can just imagine all the fun things I can do in this dress and all the places I'll go and all the concerts I'll see in this dress. So for me, red is a color of celebration. It's a color of life. And I wanted to bring some of that energy into the idea of the Red Dress Project. This poem is called Red Dress Special. Give me a red dress to wear while I'm alive. Let me dance a lover special with someone who takes me home and lays the dress on the nightstand, someone who carefully folds the fabric in the morning, whether woven silk or polyester. Give me someone who tucks me in before leaving. Bring me someone who doesn't leave at all. Let me wear my red dress while I'm alive. I want to wear a red paint smudged into the fullness of my lips, applied in a hurry with a finger on the subway, with full knowledge it will be kissed right off, only if and when I want it. Give me ochre worn across my eyes in the shape of an ancestor, a superheroine's mask, not smeared across my mouth in the shape of a handprint. I want my red dress to wear while I'm alive. The next one I'll read for you is called Teaching Treaty. This is one of those poems that kind of just came out, and I'm not entirely sure what it means yet. But there is something about the idea of criminality in it, and how indigenous folks are criminalized for being and doing the simplest things, like for gathering in groups of more than two, as per the Indian Act, or simply existing or walking down the street. This poem is called Teaching Treaty. The problem of text taking precedent in creation is the risk of non-breathing interpretations of spirit and intent. All circumstance, formality, no time for ceremonies of love, land, home, migration. No memory except the altars we've always tended in secret. A frying pan full of rocks heated on the stove, a blanket draped over the kitchen table, closed curtains, you turn me into your sweat lodge to be dismantled with a moment's notice at the inevitable knock on the door. Another suffocation, the transactional rationing of yourself to me, one scoop of flour at a time. Then the altogether denial when I trick the scale and convince you to pour an ounce too much. Sneaking fugitive apples out of your shed, stealing sweetness under my dress, you wonder aloud why I am so hungry. Existing in the borderlands of two nations and the shadow of one, criminality is our school and witchcraft is our wisdom. I spend my days dreaming up softer edges for sovereignty, nights reinscribing treaties with my tongue on your stomach. The next is called If Everything is Ceremony, Then Nothing Is. If everything is ceremony, then nothing is, he tells me with a certainty I could never desire to possess. I remain a searcher for scraps of sacredness, a witness to the fish blowing ripples on the surface of their tap water bowls, as though it will help them reach the rivers once more. We are proof that most treaties are made broken and rarely tended back whole. We are descended from no great chiefs or signatories, and our ancestors were perhaps no one of note. Still, they return to us each night, dancing shadows on the bars of our cages to remind us that dirt is holier than religion. The next one I'll read is called How to Make a Home, and it's about the first time I had an apartment, my first apartment in Toronto. It was at Oakville in St. Clair, and the manager of the apartment, I actually subletted it from Anik Jordan, who a lot of you probably know is a brilliant artist and beautiful person. One of my dearest friends, and I subletted this apartment from her, and it's a historically Black area that is being gentrified. And I ended up in this apartment, and the manager of the apartment was a Jamaican man who had lost his son to a shooting very recently. And I remember that being sort of my coming into the space of Toronto that is so imbued with this beautiful beautiful and very present Black presence in the city, which is not something that I experienced on the prairies. So this one is called How to Make a Home. It's so small in here, his frame imposing in her tiny apartment. But it's mine, she thought, ignoring his statement, her eyes tracing the lights and posters strung up along the walls. Her apartment was the one place where he would leave smelling like her. And when he left, he would leave the tracks of his scent on pillows, towels, and her hair. So she was careful to wash it just before he came over, so she could wear his scent around the next day, perhaps hoping that someone would take notice and perhaps even wonder if they belonged to each other. The smell of the old apartment itself never changed. Here she won. The air was always warm enough for clothes to slide off as easily as silk, and the hallways smelled like turmeric. She didn't have much of an appetite in those days, but still appreciated the smell of good home cooking. A poster on the wall left up by the previous tenant declared Black Lives Matter on stolen indigenous land. One morning, he knelt and gently drew smiley faces on her cut-up knees with a red pen, kissing them each left and right before taking his bag and leaving for work. Her t-shirt, lifted off and thrown to the floor from the night before, had been picked up, folded carefully, and left on the dresser. She would spend countless nights remembering that folded shirt as a sign that his gentleness was not yet entirely lost. After he left one morning and didn't come back, she renamed Toronto's neighborhoods for the days of the week they had argued loudly about love in those streets. It felt like home, so it was home. I'm going to finish off by reading a poem called How to Map the Stars. I never know whether to call them poems or pieces of prose, or I never took any like English or poetry classes in university, so I really don't know what I'm doing technically, but I just like to write. So that's what I do. I call them poems. I call them love poems, love letters, whatever you want to say. And this one was written, I read a poem yesterday about Colton Bushy, and this one was written about the preliminary trial in the Battlefords for Colton's killer, Gerald Stanley. How to Map the Stars. When I'm old, I'll tell you I remember dancing. I remember morning ceremonies at the Squamish, Hokomelum, Tsleil-Waututh waterfronts, shutting down malls in a Misquachiwa sky again, organizing all night in a Iqaluit, and the chief setting up camp by that funny little concrete flame. I will tell you about the day we danced in front of the old rail station in North Battleford, our drums shaking the spikes from the tracks and eventually shutting down the courtroom inside. When we sang those love songs louder after the cops told us to settle down so the trial could continue. Settle down. It was mourning and celebration all in one. That's what most of us did in those early days, counting our time in breaths, breathlessness, and how many round dance songs before we hit the ground. I will tell you I remember every time they said our starvation was natural and dispossession was progress. Every time they said our freedom was impossible and how this made us want it even more. I remember how upset they were when we started growing tobacco and vegetables in the plots of wasteland they had reserved for gas stations. When I'm old, I'll tell you I remember refusal. I remember walking around what used to be the financial district in the disciplined spoon and reimagining it as our own once more, feet sore from marching, but unwilling to give in to sleep. I remember the days our people were locked up for fighting pipelines, for graffiti, for sex, for smudging, for living. I remember the night we broke them out and brought them all home. When I'm old, I'll tell you I remember learning to twist copper wire snares from big rough hands that didn't need hide mitts in the bush but wore them anyway, just to show off that someone cared enough to keep those hands warm. I remember catching my first fish, taught exactly how to knock a pike on the head so it didn't suffer long. This is how we cherished kindnesses in a world that afforded few. I remember the Red River and Red Rising rebellions. I remember the earrings my sister made me with beads the color of northern lights to wear to that extravagant party with Nehiyaw philosophers, Dene physicists, and Anishinaabe poets after the first time a Métis went into outer space. We danced then too, and I remember waking up by the fire after a bit too much strawberry champagne, surrounded by a circle of friends telling their recreation stories with shadow figures on the wall. When I'm old, I'll tell you I remember learning about freedom beyond anthems and passports, and how we never went back once we knew the kind of love bound only by shorelines, prairie skies, and forest floors. The dream of these 12 moons, just like the 12,000 before and after, is freedom. And one last thing before I forget, remember, our memories contain every future, every sunrise you will ever need. Kinanas Gomaten, until we are free. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erica.